Excuse me, I cough right as I unmute myself. Welcome. Um, you can probably tell last week I lost my voice and it is finally coming back. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. We've got a little bit to cover today. We're going to talk about culture with the two readings that we had assigned here. So we had Kotak chapter 2 and the minor article, which I'll spend a little bit of time on a little later today. So we'll get going. I'm not sure. We might even end a few minutes early. I'll play it by ear, but at least we're not driving, so hopefully we're all good. Now, forgive me, I'm closing something on my screen. There we go. So when we look at culture, to kind of explain it, we're also going to take a look at our own culture. In fact, kind of throughout this class, yes, we'll be looking at many other cultures. It's cultural anthropology, of course, but we're also going to take a look at our own. Even if we can sometimes be the outsider looking at our own culture and asking the question like, why do we do this? Or is it weird that we do blank? Something like that. For example, you could ask 100 Americans on the street what they think the definition of an American is or what an American should look like and act like. And you're probably going to get close to 100 different answers. Even though we all have the same identity of American, we may have different ideals of what a an American looks like. To define here, culture means traditions and customs transmitted through learning. So we'll bring that up in a moment about how culture is learned. And sometimes it's learned very obviously, where we're taught specifically what to do or say to be a proper member of our society. And sometimes it's learned subconsciously, where maybe you see, as a little kid, you see someone get bullied for doing something a little weird. And you aren't being told not to do that, but you witness the bad reactions other kids have, and you think, well, I'm not going to do that. Sorry, my screen is doing something weird. It's like, hey, you're sharing your screen. And I'm like, yeah, I know. That's the point. Sorry, I'm just talking back to my computer. So, looking at American values. We can learn a lot about a society by what we place as super important, where we value things. Something that Americans typically all value is independence. We celebrate our independence from Britain every July, and we like to think of ourselves as very independent people. We also place a lot of value on, sorry, somebody is uh, we place a lot of value on money. So what's interesting is money and independence being two of them. The other is nuclear family. Nuclear family basically just means like your mom, dad, and two kids. That immediate family, not including extended family. Independence and money, we can also see that we place a lot of value on it because that's what we take away as punishment. So if you do something illegal in our country, something that is so taboo, we've made it just not allowed, you usually get punished in one of two ways. The lesser punishment is we take some of your money. If you're out speeding in your car and you get pulled over, you're going to get a speeding ticket. It's going to take some of your money. If you speed enough and drive recklessly enough, they will take your license away. That is taking away your independence. Now you have to rely on public transit or friends. Similarly, if you drive bad enough, we'll take away your independence by making you do jail time. And so you can see where we really place that emphasis there. Another area, forgive me, I'm going to check my phone for a second because I have a student trying to get in. Um, yes. Just reaching out because I want to make sure I'm not leaving anybody in the dust. I know Zoom can be tricky. So, another place where we can see emphasis on values is greetings. How do we greet somebody, either a new person or somebody we know already? In America, we usually do a handshake. Um, Sometimes we'll do a kiss on the cheek. But usually that's not the most common way Americans greet each other. Usually how we greet each other is a handshake or maybe a hug, or the dab that is kind of a mix of a handshake and a hug, a half hug. So what's interesting is here we have some distance between us when we greet, usually, especially if it's somebody we don't know. We do the handshake. That's keeping 2 arms distance between us. Europeans will do a kiss on each cheek, or sometimes two on each cheek. And it's not a kiss in the sense of like really planting one on the cheek. You're more kind of touching cheeks and doing a kissy noise. But for an American, that is very, very much in our personal space. Myself, years ago, I got to travel to France, and I knew I had been studying the French language and customs. I knew that they greet people with a kiss on the cheek. But even though I knew that, being an American, the first time it happened to me, I was very flustered because that was so much physical intimacy with somebody I just met versus for the French person, he was thinking like this is a normal greeting. Why is she all flustered? But I was not prepared. And yeah, I'm with you. I think it's a very American thing to not like people touching us. We're not used to it. We're like, mm-mm, you're in my bubble. What's interesting is they can adapt depending on the time or depending on the subculture. So when COVID hit, at the very beginning of COVID, I was working in corporate America. And before we went work from home, they had us, they were trying to get us at least to switch up our handshakes because of germs. And they wanted us to bump elbows. I have no idea if that actually would have taken off in America, but we really didn't have time. Like I saw this trend starting, and then like a week later, we went work from home. So we were trying to adapt, but it didn't really take off. Some of us nod and do a smile and nod when we see people. And I chose two very different gifs of this. The bottom one, now full disclosure, I believe that is a gif from the TV series Dexter, which is about a serial killer. So I'm not trying to say people who do that nod are serial killer. That has nothing to do with that. I chose it because I have learned recently that there is a stereotypical white person smile that we, myself included, do that he's doing in that smile, that gif. He's closed mouth, kind of doing this very like, it's hard to describe smile with the nod. While the nod is supposed to be like, yes, hello, I recognize you, it's less about solidarity, it's just a greeting. And I say stereotypical white person. I am that stereotypical white person. Whenever I do that closed smile nod, smile thing, that usually is when I make eye contact with someone, but I don't really know them. And I want to be sociable enough to not look like an outsider, but I don't want to be so sociable that they want to talk to me. That's usually when I personally do that smile. The other gentleman at the top is doing more of the up nod that you see within the Black American community, which is more solidarity more than greeting, where my understanding is, yes, it is if you see your friend, but it also can be just like, let's say you're a Black person and you go to an event and there are no other Black people, and you notice that right away, like, oh, well, I'm the only one. And then around the corner comes another Black person, and you share that nod as a like, oh my God, I'm not the only one, even though you don't know each other. That's one example. Now, an interesting greeting is the hongi, which we see within the Maori people of New Zealand. And what's really cool about this is it tells us that there's a lot of trust here. What you do is you press your foreheads and your noses together and close your eyes and share a breath together. Yes, it can be a little awkward for Westerners that are not used to it. You see Prince Harry doing it at a diplomatic meeting years ago. It can be a little awkward because if the kiss kiss is too much for me, this is very, very intimate. But because it's intimate, it's showing us that this is a peacetime greeting. The Maori people historically went to war, not all the time, but a bit. And so they knew how to defend themselves. This greeting is only going to be done when you really trust each other because you're closing your eyes, you're being very vulnerable. If it's somebody you don't trust, you can't guarantee that if I close my eyes, I don't know if they're going to stab me. This has to be a peacetime greeting. Now, hopefully, this TikTok will work. It's very silly, but it is a Mexican person and a Maori person greeting each other, and it's just kind of cute. Traditional way.
So how do we do that?
For a little silly, you may not have been able to hear it that well. One of the downsides of my technology. But if the hongi, you can hear my voice going, if it looks familiar and you're a Disney fan, it was in Moana. And while it was a very cute movie for a lot of things, as a cultural anthropologist, I enjoyed it because it had actual depictions of Polynesian and Maori people of the area. So I thought that was beautiful that they actually incorporated this as a very good moment in the movie, where again, it's all about trust. And yeah, it's a cool movie with good music, in my opinion. But now I mentioned that culture is learned. It's learned, it's symbolic, and it's shared. And I'll try to give you some examples on the next slides. Some of these examples might seem obvious, some may not, but try to give you some examples from our own culture. So when I say it's learned, excuse me, one way is through enculturation, the process by which culture is learned and transmitted across the generations. Think of if your family celebrates Christmas, think of your Christmas traditions with family. Do you open gifts on Christmas Eve? Do you open them on Christmas morning? Um, when I was a kiddo, I was raised Catholic. So our usually we were not allowed to open our gifts until after Mass, which was really difficult for a little ADHD child because it was hard for me to pay attention in Mass anyways. It was even harder to pay attention when I knew there was a stack of presents at home. I was like, let's get home. Difficult, but I did it. Some cultural groups have specifics of what to do on Christmas, when to open gifts. Others have traditions that are just family specific. But you learn that from the adults that you grew up with. Culture is also very symbolic. Symbols refer to something verbal or nonverbal that stands for something else. So the example I have is the red stop sign. In the US, stop signs are these red octagons with white outline and the white lettering that says stop. It's become so synonymous with stopping that even if we took the lettering off and just had the red octagon, most of us while driving would still know what to do. We would recognize that symbol. And other countries have adopted the same symbol. So even if you don't speak French or you don't speak Spanish, you can figure out that arrête means stop, alto means stop, because it's the same symbol. Now, the warning is, while culture is symbolic, the symbols can change. They can change within the same culture over time, or they can change between two different cultures. The example I have is the peace sign, the two-finger peace sign. So nowadays, most of us use it. I'll put myself on blast. I'll use a peace sign when I don't know what to do with my hands in a photo. And a friend says, "Hey, let me get a picture of you by whatever it is I'm near." And I say, "Okay." And I'm not a model, so I don't know what to do with my hands. Sometimes I'll throw up a peace sign. But it started back in World War II as V for victory. It was not about peace and love. It was about winning a war, and you win a war through diplomacy and violence. So, the world leaders of the Allied troops, like Winston Churchill here in the black and white photo, he's throwing up V for victory. He's not saying peace and love. He's saying, we're going to win this war. The reason why it changed is we ended up with a counterculture in the 60s into the 70s of hippies. Hippies are very anti-war. They're all about peace and love. So they co-opted this symbol and said it's no longer V for victory. Now it means no war. Let's stop all wars. Let's have peace and love and harmony. Nowadays, like I said, it's kind of a thing you throw up to try to look cool or do something with your hands. But be wary of how you throw up a peace sign. So, the backwards peace sign. Now, if I understand correctly, the backwards peace sign started more within the African American community. But the two examples I have here, I was just looking for a GIF. On the right is Amy Poehler at an awards show, and she's doing a little bit where she's supposed to be showing how laid back she is and that she can't even be bothered to dress up. It's no big deal. And she's showing that by doing the double backwards and sideways peace sign, which usually signifies I'm chill, I'm hip, I don't even care, that kind of attitude. The woman on the left is Joanna Lumley, a British actress, and you can kind of tell by her motion she's not chill, she's not relaxed. She's pretty angry about something. She's sticking out her tongue. The backwards peace sign, straight up and down, and especially with the vulgar motion of like pumping your hand, in Britain and parts of the UK and Australia, it's basically flipping the bird, flipping the middle finger. It's an FU kind of a symbol. I bring that up because years ago, former President George Bush Sr. was traveling to Australia trying to be cool. I think this was 1992. That man I would not describe as cool and hip ever, so I don't know why he bothered trying now, but or then. But he traveled to Australia, got in front of a crowd of Australians, and threw up the backwards peace sign. But he did it straight up and down. And so, luckily, Australia has a good sense of humor and kind of laughed at the fact that the American president just flipped them all off. And one of his aides had to be like, "Yeah, don't do that." Don't. So be cautious. A hand gesture or symbol in our culture may not translate 100% correctly. Be wary if you are traveling to make sure that you're not accidentally flipping off an entire country or something. A great example of symbols changing is what we know as the swastika. So nowadays, the swastika is a symbol of hate. It is tied to the Nazi Party, but it was not always. So on the right top is a bracelet, an antique bracelet from the Navajo Nation, or Dene people in southwestern United States. That symbol is ancient for them, and it signifies the four directions or the four winds. On the top left, this is a symbol of good luck in many Asian cultures, but specifically, I'm thinking China. Again, an ancient symbol. It's supposed to show like unity and luck and love and good life. Nowadays, after World War II and that era, we now see this symbol as a symbol of hate, like I said, because it's tied to the Nazi Party. Context is going to be your friend in this situation. So, what I mean by that is If you are going, it's almost the Lunar New Year. Let's say you go to a Lunar New Year festival predominantly put on by the Chinese Student Association, and you walk in and there's banners in red and gold with little gold swastikas on them. You can rest easy knowing that that symbol is for life and luck. It's Chinese people wishing you a happy new year. If you're walking down the street and it's spray painted on the side of a bus stop with a hateful message, not a Chinese person wishing you good luck. So context is your big clue here. See where you're seeing the symbol and then figure out what the actual message is. Because unfortunately, there's tons of antiques from the Navajo Nation or China with this symbol on it. And it's unfortunate that we now associate it with something bad when for thousands of years it was, good luck. That is not me saying that you can go doodle swastikas on everything and argue with people that you mean good luck. Because, like I said, context is the clue here. You have to remember who's doing it and what they're actually trying to spread. Now, I mentioned culture is also shared. It needs to be shared by more than two people, but less than everyone. We'll get into in a few minutes about universal things that all humans do, like breathing. We all breathe. We all eat, but what we eat, how we eat, when we eat, all of that is going to be dependent on our culture. So, an example is taking off your shoes when you get in your house. A lot of Americans, we get picked on by a lot of other cultures because many Americans do not take their shoes off when they come home or come over to somebody's house. Now, I will admit sometimes I leave my shoes on, especially if I'm going to like leave right away again and I'm wearing boots that you have to lace up. I'm not taking those off and back. No, I'll just leave them on. I, however, am a big arguer. I do not think shoes belong on furniture. Ugh. But I know many Americans that argue with me about that. So, as an American, you might take your shoes off, but the majority of Americans do not. I have Mr. Rogers up there because if you're old like me, you loved Mr. Rogers growing up. One of the things he did in his show is he came home. I'm using air quotes. It was a studio, but it was made up to look like his home. And he came home at the beginning of the episode and he takes off his jacket and puts on his sweater. And then he takes off his outside shoes and puts on his house shoes. Some Americans, because we grew up watching him do that, we like to take our shoes off when we get home. If it's good enough for Mr. Rogers, it's good enough for me. But as a blanket statement of Americans, we don't do that. Versus taking off your shoes when you get to a home or school in, say, Japan, like the little kids on the slide, that is the custom. You may have the rare Japanese person that doesn't want to take their shoes off, but for the most part, their cultural norm is you take your shoes off. That means it's not universal that every human does it, but it's clearly the majority of Japan does it. So it is part of their culture. Another great example of culture being shared is dance. Um, Dancing isn't biologically important to us in the sense that, like, if you don't dance, you're not going to die from lack of dance. But culturally, just about every culture has some form of music and dance. So clearly, it's something that can unite us. But dancing can look very, very different. I bring up the Maori people again because they have a traditional dance called the haka, which is a pre-battle amp up, where you basically perform a dance with your team before a battle, and it does two jobs. On one hand, it amps up your energy. You're all doing a dance together, it's choreographed, you know what to do, and you're just getting that energy up. It also works to be intimidating to the other team. If you're a rugby fan, you've seen a haka probably. If you've seen the New Zealand All Blacks, that is the name of their term. It's not a racial thing. But they do a haka before every game, and it's really impressive. Irish step dancing is an interesting one. It is not a pre-battle dance, even though I would find it intimidating as well. It is a very stiff dance. From the waist up, you pretty much don't move. And from especially the knees down, it's just going bonkers. It's a beautiful dance as well, but very, very different. Looking at our core values, what I mean by that are key, basic, or central values that integrate a culture. Something that a lot of Americans pride themselves in is our very strong work ethic. Now, to be a little critical, do I think Americans do have a strong work ethic? Yes, I think we do. I think it goes back to when we created this nation 250 years ago. I think a lot of our founding people had very strong work ethics, and that traveled through to the future generations. However, I would argue that nowadays it's less about us being just workaholics and loving it, and more about the necessity because of our economy. So a lot of us out there work two or three jobs. And yeah, you're going to meet somebody who works a 9 to 5 corporate job and then does Uber on the weekends. And they do it just because they genuinely love it. Yeah. But for the majority of Americans that are doing all of these side hustles, it's less about love of work and more about I have bills to pay and my one job isn't cutting it. So, I would ask us to take a little bit of a look in of like what really is behind our strong work ethic. And we talk a lot about the American dream. What the American dream used to be is that anyone could come here or come from any background, get a job, be successful, and support a partner and two or three kids, plus own your own home. And back in the 1950s, that was plausible. That was something you could actually do. I'm not saying it was easy. You still had to work hard, but you could do it. Versus now in 2026, I'm going to be a bummer. Um, if you have a nuclear family, meaning a spouse and two kids, you need at least 2 bedrooms. The federal minimum wage is really low, and there is no state in our country where you can work a 40-hour job at minimum wage and afford rent on a 2 bedroom apartment. We're not even talking about owning a home. We're just talking about renting. It is, I'm probably preaching to the choir because you're probably all sitting there like, yeah, I pay rent, Stephanie. I know it's ridiculous. But it's the sad reality. That American dream is no longer plausible for the vast majority of Americans. And this is not me trying to get like political or, rile you up or anything like that, but to rather say we need to take a look at it of is the American dream actually attainable anymore? And if it isn't, then what do we need to fix? Do we need to change the goalpost and make the American dream different? Or do we need to change America to make the American dream plausible again? The good news is I'm not going to make you answer that or solve that on your own. Just something to think about. I mean, if you do come up with a solution, by all means, share it with the rest of us. But don't worry, that's not like your task for the semester. And yeah, I agree. Cost of living is ridiculous right now. Oh boy, grocery shopping. Yeah, I go grocery shopping and I barely fill up my cart. And I'm like, that'll be $150. Haha, yay. It has stopped me from eating out as often, probably saving money there because I used to be a DoorDash queen. Um, so when we look at non-human primates, we share a lot in common with them. We also have a lot that's different. One of the things we share is tool use. Now, we're seeing tool use in pretty much most of the primates out there, especially the great apes. But we're also seeing it in other species, including crows and octopi. I actually just saw an article that scientists are now, researchers are studying. They are seeing tool use in cows. There is I'm trying to remember her name. I think it's Victoria, the cow in Austria, who has been noted using tools to scratch herself. Really simple tool use, but it's interesting to see other animals how they adopt tools and use them. Most non-human primates also live in cooperative relationships and social groups. Now, humans, for the most part, we do better with social groups, communities, but you're always going to have the exception to the rule, the hermit that wants to live out in the woods by themselves. Similarly, while most of the primates live in groups, you have the occasional, like the species orangutan. Orangutans are pretty solitary. They kind of are the hermit in the woods. Excuse me. I guess I can hit the next slide. This is just a visual example of some of the similarities physically we have. This is a chimpanzee hand next to a modern human hand. You can see a lot of similarities. Four fingers and a thumb, very similar tactile areas. The main difference is a chimpanzee's hand is much longer than ours. That is because, as a species, they spend way more time in the trees than you or I. Even if you're like a really good tree climber and you love putting your hammock up there, as a species, we don't really hang out in trees very often. Chimps do. And so the longer the hand, the more you can grab onto a branch and really be sturdy up there. But they have the same basic tools we do. So it's not surprising that we're seeing chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans use and make tools just like we do. Another similarity, when I say we have social groups, primates groom each other. So, like these two chimps right here, one is picking through the other's fur for any kind of like twig, bug, anything that gets in there. And you might think to yourself, "Why don't groom my friend Stephanie?" And yeah, you may not brush each other's hair, but I think so for chimps, the grooming is a social bond and it helps form hierarchies of like who's in charge and who's intimate with each other. Similarly, if you're talking to somebody, let's say it's just a colleague you don't know that well, and you notice they have an eyelash on their cheek, you're probably going to point it out, but you wouldn't reach over and pluck it. You would just tell them, like, oh, you have an eyelash on your cheek. Versus if it's somebody you know really well, like a sibling or a really close friend, you probably will just reach over and take it off their face because you're a lot closer to them. So when I say intimate, I don't mean romantically intimate necessarily, but just comfortable enough to be close with this person physically. Oh, excuse me. Now, sometimes when we get into like archaeology and things like that, you've probably heard about the Stone Age and stone tools. And when we talk about ancient humans, we talk about them as tool makers because we were very, very good tool makers. But oftentimes, archaeology talks only about stone tools. That's because that's what survives the archaeological record. So when things get buried in the ground for thousands of millions of years, they can decompose versus stuff made out of rock or bone will survive a lot longer. So, realistically, well, yes, the first tools we've found are stone, like these projectile points here, and they are very important. I'm not trying to say they're not. But realistically, the first tool humans probably made was a baby sling, like the woman on the right. So if you've ever carried around a baby, you know that they take up at least one of your arms. And like I said, one of our best tools are our hands. That's the best tool we've got. And so when one is taken away, we as a species, we're probably going to figure out, okay, how do I get both my hands back? Because baby has to nap and I have to move or I have to garden or I have to do something and I need my hands, but I can't let the baby just sit there. I have to keep the baby on me for safety. Many cultures pretty much have a baby sling of some sort. Even modern Americans, we've got the baby Bjorn. We've got different slings to put babies on us. And one of the reasons why we would have wanted to do that is this is something that our ancestors would have been able to do easier. So we don't get heavy into evolution in this class, but I do want to say this is not to say that we evolved from chimpanzees. We did not. But we and chimpanzees have common ancestors. And so those ancestors, we're talking millions of years ago, they would have looked more like chimpanzees than us, meaning they would have been a little hairier. Now, if you're hairy like a chimpanzee and you need to travel with your toddler, you can take that baby and toss him on your back, and the baby will grab a hold of your fur and hang on for dear life. And it's pretty secure. But as we evolved and we lost that body hair, we no longer could do that. But what's really cool is we can see the leftovers of our genetics. If you've ever been around a baby, I don't recommend handing them random things, but if you did, they will grip on with like a death vice grip. And I've had it before with my nieces and nephews where they've done that to my hair. And then you have to like pry their little baby hand off the hair. And you're thinking, how do you have such a strong grip? It's leftover evolutionarily from being able to grab onto mom's body hair. Mom just doesn't have the body hair anymore. So we still have that grip strength when we're born, which is impressive, but we've discovered baby slings instead of having a very hairy back. I mentioned we also have a lot that we differ from primates. Humans, for the most part, are more cooperative with resources. Now, just like I said, there's exceptions for the community. There's going to be people that hoard resources. There's going to be people that do not share. But usually we're a bit more cooperative. A funny thing that makes us differ that everyone always remembers is our mating habits. So, for the majority of mammals, not all, but the majority, they mate during a mating season, meaning there is a specific time when the females ovulate, and that is when they have sexual intercourse. Because the main goal is to get the females pregnant and have more babies. So, why would you have sex when she's not ovulating? There's no point for these species. Humans, as well as bonobos, which are our closest living primate relative, pigs, and dolphins, among a few others, are some of the only species that mate for fun. Meaning, as a species, we have sex just for the fun of it. Now, on the individual level, that can differ. I have met many humans who genuinely only have sex in order to have babies. Yes. But, and this isn't saying that we're all promiscuous, but rather to say, as a species, even if you're monogamous and you get married to someone, most humans don't reserve sexual intercourse only for when she's ovulating. They also do it just for funsies. So it's an interesting little thing where many other primates, it's literally only when she's ovulating, because that's the only goal in mind. On the note of like marriages and such, we also are the only ones that have marriage and kinship. So we have like family titles. For instance, I didn't call my late grandmother Shirley, even though that was her name. I called her Grandma. That was my title for her. So we have titles like that, and we usually trace our heritage through two or more lines, meaning both parents. Although I will say it is, I talk about crows a lot because they're my favorite bird, and they're just freakishly smart. But we also, animal researchers, have noted crows visiting their parents, as adults, which I think is adorable. Now, I mentioned how there are some things humans do that we all do. Those habits are called universal or tied to universality, meaning it's something that exists in every culture. Breathing, eating, birth, death, all of those things are universal. Some are biological, some are cultural. So we all have families, but who you consider family might be different depending on culture. A biological universality is infant dependency. So if you're a farm kid or a hunter and you've like paid attention to prey animals, you will know that when they give birth, their babies are pretty much up and walking very quickly. And that is necessity because if the herd has to move, that baby's got to move with them. Versus, I'm gonna crap talk human babies for a minute. Hope not. They're fun. But human babies, we're pretty useless for the first like 2 years of our lives. The first year or so, we can't communicate besides crying. We can't walk. We can't feed ourselves. Like we are really, really dependent on our adults. And one of the reasons for that is technically we're born a little too early. If you look at the human gestation period, now I'm realizing for any of you that have carried children to term and given birth, you might be thinking, Stephanie, 9 months is plenty time. Not saying that you have to do it longer, but as a species, we give birth a little too early. Technically, the baby should develop a little bit longer, but the reason why we can't is, as a species, we have really big heads and pretty narrow birth canals. So if that baby develops longer and gets bigger, we would have more complications in giving birth. So the trade-off is we give birth a little earlier than maybe we should, and that baby is way more dependent on us versus other species where the baby is kind of up and walking around pretty quickly. Generality would be like the next step inward. If universal is something that every single member of the species does, generality is when the vast majority does it, but not everyone. So a cultural pattern or trait that exists in some, but not all societies. An example would be the nuclear family. Nuclear again means that core family, the parents and the kids. And a lot of Americans will go as so far as to say they mean specifically a heterosexual couple and their biological offspring is nuclear family. America has a tendency to put that forth as the norm, but only 20% of American families are considered nuclear typical. And it's not universal throughout the world. Even in America, it's not universal. I think of if you asked me to draw my family tree, I would include some people that I don't really talk to that much, but we're technically related. But I would also include like my best friend and her family. I am not related to her in any way. No blood relation, no legal relation like marriage. But I have known her over 35 years, and her kids call me an aunt. I call them my nieces and nephews. Are we technically related? No, but that's my family. 'Cause like that's my family. Now, particularity, hopefully this shows up on yours. I have this little window on my screen I can't seem to get rid of. Nope, I just made it worse. Stop pushing buttons, Stephanie. Okay, so particularity. This is a distinctive or unique culture trait, pattern, or integration. So something that is very unique. Good examples are funerary practices, because while death is universal, how we mark that occasion is not. That is very particular to each culture. Same with coming of age rituals like quinceañeras, bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs. Basically, any major life event, you're going to see the cultural particularity. And I remember when I was a teenager feeling a little robbed because white American culture, we used to have Sweet 16 as like your coming of age ritual, but that was not a thing in my community. And so I remember having friends that would be like, "Oh, I have my bat mitzvah." And I'm like, "I want one." Or, "Oh, I'm going to my cousin's quinceañera." And I'm like, "That sounds fun. I want." So it doesn't mean every society has it, but we usually do have some sort of coming of age ritual or big birthday that we celebrate. I guess mine would have been 18, which was kind of a letdown because I turned 18 and I had the realization of like, what can you do at 18 to celebrate? I can buy cigarettes, but I don't smoke. I can join the military, but I don't want to. I can vote, but there wasn't an election coming up. And so I think I went and bought a scratch off lotto ticket of like, woo, something I can do at 18. So I mentioned that death is universal, and we'll talk a little bit more about death and funerary practices later in the semester. But how we mark the occasion is what's different. So something I'm seeing change in our culture is how we're approaching funerals. And so when I grew up, what I was used to is if I went to a funeral, it looked like the one on the left. A very somber occasion. Sometimes there was a Christian church service, sometimes not. Everybody wore dark drab colors, and it was very somber. Now, after the funeral, we would still have a quote party, but it was pretty much like a deli spread of sandwiches and people just kind of quietly conversing and sharing stories of the deceased. On the right is a New Orleans jazz style funeral where they will have they will do the same kind of celebration for different events. You can also do it for like a wedding or a big birthday, but you basically hire a jazz band to parade you through the street. For people not from the area, that may seem disrespectful because they may see that as, oh my gosh, they're celebrating someone's death. And that's not what's happening. They're celebrating the life they led. Where I said I'm seeing some changes is I'm used to funerals like on the left. And I used to work at a clothing store. And what I noticed is every few months or so, we would get someone in who was shopping for a funeral of a loved one. But what they were calling it was a celebration of life. And I was also seeing a trend where instead of wearing black and drab clothing, the family of the deceased would pick their favorite color, like maybe it's red or royal purple, and then they would encourage all the guests to dress in that color as a way to celebrate the life that was led. Rather than focusing on the fact that they're gone, we're celebrating how awesome they were. And yes, we're going to miss them. It's still a sad moment, but we're seeing a little bit of a change. Now, an example of a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Minute category of funerary practices. In Taiwan, there has been an uptick of hiring funeral strippers or exotic dancers, go-go dancers, and the like. And for an American, that might seem a little weird, but there are a lot of funerary customs around the world where dancing is common. So having a professional dancer doesn't seem that far off. Having an exotic dancer, they cost money and you have to tip them. It's pricey. So having one at a funeral is supposed to signify wealth, that, oh, the deceased had enough money to hire a funeral stripper. I guess he was doing all right. It also, as you can probably guess, brings in more attendees. And I'm not going to lie to you. If I heard, like, let's say a colleague of mine who I knew in passing, but I didn't really know that well, and they pass away, I would be sad and I would send my condolences. But honestly, if I didn't know them that well, I might not go to the funeral because I might think, it's going to be mostly family. I'll just stay home and send my condolences. I'll send some flowers. But I'm not gonna lie, if they said, here's where the funeral is, and also there will be strippers, I would be very intrigued and I would probably go just to see what this entails. Because I'm a nosy person, I'd be too intrigued. So you can see how it draws more people in. Now, where did this trend even come from? Feel free to correct my horrible pronunciation of this person's name. I'm doing my best, but I'm recognizing that I don't speak the language naturally. So in 2017, former Chiayi County Council Speaker Tung Shang passed away, and his son was in charge of the funeral procession. So they were supposed to do a procession after the funeral, before the burial, through the streets. And because he was a pretty big politician, they were going to tell people, like, come to the street and, wave your goodbyes, things like that. So his son had a dream, and in the dream, his late father came to him in a vision and said, I want my funeral to be hilarious. And his son thought on it and said, what's goofier than 50 Jeeps with 50 pole dancers? And so that was his funerary procession. 50 Jeeps, each with a pole, each with a dancer, proceeding slowly, for the safety of the ladies, slowly through the street. And it drew quite a big crowd because, again, if it was a politician that you were like, I didn't really know him, whatever, you might not go to the funeral procession. But if you hear there's 50 pole dancers, you're going to be like, yeah, I'm going to go see this. This is an odd one. And so it kind of gained popularity. It's already, as far as I know, kind of dying out, no pun intended, but it's kind of diminishing. And that's what I kind of said. It was a little blip in the radar. I wasn't sure if in 50 years this was going to be the new trend and that it goes all through Taiwan and into China and into Japan, or if it was just going to be a random blip. And I think it's going to be a random blip where 50 years from now we'll look back and say, hey, remember that like a decade where funeral pole dancers were all the rage in Taiwan? And then we'll say, yeah, that was interesting. And then we'll move on. So it's an interesting take on a funerary procession. So culture is supposed to teach and guide the individual. And what's interesting is the bigger the culture, the more likely it is to get contested, meaning the more mainstream something is and the more people are doing it, the more likely you are to have a subgroup break off and say, actually, we hate that and we're going to do the exact opposite. But at what point does counterculture become the new culture? So, for example, I have two punks on the screen from the 1970s into the 80s when the punk scene was really big. And they were counterculture. The culture at the time, the norm was to be preppy, to be like straight-laced, very fashion forward, chic. And Punk said, I'm not washing my hair. In fact, I'm going to shave a mohawk and spike it up in bright colors. And I'm not wearing your preppy sweater and loafers. I'm going to wear combat boots with spikes on them and a leather jacket with patches and spikes. And that was counterculture. That was shocking to the norm people. But that was 50 years ago. Now, this is in no way trying to, because the punk scene is still alive and well. But if I saw somebody with brightly colored mohawk and spikes on their boots and their jacket and ripped jeans, I can't guarantee that they would call themselves a punk. they might have just bought all of that at Hot Topic. Now, is it going to be as quote authentic punk as some others? No, but you can basically look the part and work as a barista or something. And that's, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But what I am saying is the counterculture has now become the culture. And so what happens is the people that want to push against it now have to find even more dramatic ways to kind of push against it. And we all have a public versus a private persona. These punks doing that makeup and hair takes a lot of effort. That's a lot of skill. And so, if you came over to their house on a random Tuesday afternoon that they weren't planning on going anywhere, they're probably not going to look like that. They're going to look like you and I. They're going to be in leggings and a hoodie, with their hair in a bun because they're not going through all that if nobody's going to see it. It's supposed to be a little bit of a show. And we all kind of do that to some extent. Now, this is a long slide, so I'm going to take a moment, but don't panic. I usually try not to throw that much text at you, but it's basically looking at how cultures change. And what we see is diffusion. Diffusion is borrowing of cultural traits between societies. So when two or more societies consciously trade ideas or trade cultural norms, it can be done in three different ways. Direct is on purpose. So I have examples of like trade or marriage. Trade is the really obvious example. Culture A goes to culture B and they say, hey, you have red beads and those are really pretty. We don't have those. But we do have yellow beads and I'll give you yellow for blue. And now they've got it, both have both. And so you've got that diffusion, that direct diffusion. There's also, unfortunately, forced diffusion. That is colonization. So, in the first example, you have two cultures coming in contact and saying, hey, I like your stuff. Ooh, I like your stuff. Let's trade. Colonizing is culture A lands at culture B and says, we own you now. You're ours. Your land is ours. Everything is ours. And we're going to force you to live like us. So we're going to take your stuff and we're also going to force you to take ours. And I mean force, like the punishment is death. And that's not voluntary. If your punishment is death, that's a really easy decision. You're going to go with like, yeah, okay, I don't want to die, so I guess I'll do what you say. Indirect sounds like a bad math problem. A to C by way of B. Usually I draw on the board for this, so I'll try to do it verbally. Hopefully it makes sense. If you want to know more about it, look up the Kula ring, Kula. It gets way more in depth. But basically, let's say you have three cultures, A, B, and C. A has yellow beads, B has red beads, and C has blue. But A and C have no contact with each other. Let's say where they are located, there's an ocean between them. They're just not going to come into contact. And yet, somehow, they have each other's beads. How did that happen? It's because they're both trading with culture B. So I'm trying to remember who I said has what. Culture A has yellow, culture C has blue, but they have yellow and blue as well as red because A is trading yellow with red in B, C is trading blue for red and yellow, and now B is taking the blue and trading back again with culture A. So culture A and culture C have no contact, but because they both have contact with a neighbor, they end up with each other's either product or cultural norm or language. And that happens over and over again. Bronislaw Malinowski was one of the big guys that helped us understand that because of the Kula ring. He basically was looking at different island nations, and there were some that had no contact with each other, but would share language or would share customs. And that's what he was trying to figure out, like, how in the heck are you two sharing things with no contact? And it's because they have contact with a third party. Now, acculturation is an exchange of cultural features between groups in firsthand contact. A great example of this are pidgin languages, pidgin with a D, not like the bird. Hawaii has a pidgin language. Creole down in like New Orleans would technically be a pidgin language as well, I believe. What happens is, I'll use New Orleans as an example. So when New Orleans was booming, you had groups of Native Americans speaking their languages. You had white people speaking English and French. And then you had a whole ton of African people brought over on slave ships from West Africa, and they were all speaking different languages. So, what happens when you have all these communities trying to coexist in one area? You got to learn to speak the same language. But if I'm, say, from West Africa and I speak this language, it's going to take me a long time to learn English and French and the other West African languages and the Native American language. That's going to take way too long. Similarly, everybody else is struggling the same. So, what you do is you find similar words and you start there. And like, let's say French and English, you've got color and couleur, similar enough. And then you kind of find a similar kind of word. Okay, what does it mean in this West African language? And you end up creating a new language, which is why if you studied French like I do, I studied from people from France. If I go down to New Orleans and I hear Creole or Cajun French, I'm going to be able to pick out like every third or fourth word because it's not going to sound like the French I learned. It's going to sound like an amalgamy of other languages because it is. And then lastly, then we'll be done with the slide, I swear. You have independent invention. When different societies come up with the same concept independently from each other. A great example is dough pockets with meat. So if you're from Michigan or if you're new here, the UP, the Upper Peninsula, the Yoopers up there, they're very proud of pasties and they are delicious. But we have a tendency as Michiganders to make it sound like they're completely unique and nobody else has them. And technically, the UP pasty is passed down from English and Welsh immigrants. But England and Wales are not the only ones that have invented that. We also have empanadas, we have samosas. What I think is fascinating is a bunch of different cultures at different times all invented the same basic concept of taking dough, making a pocket, filling it with meat and vegetable, and then cooking it and sealing it up. Now, how you make the dough, what type of meat, what type of vegetable, what type of seasoning, all that is going to be different. An empanada is not going to taste exactly like a samosa, but the same basic concept is there, which personally I love. I love that we were like, yeah, I want a travel snack and invented the exact same thing over and over again. Now, adaptation are the processes when organisms or how organisms cope with environmental forces and stresses. And an interesting example is high altitude living. Now, here in Michigan, we're pretty close to the sea level. So we don't have mountains really. So we don't experience high altitude very often unless you travel. Looking at the Andes Mountains, so especially around Peru in South America, they're really high altitude. The picture on the left, but the person on the right is a colleague of mine, Dr. Velda Black, who's done tons of research in the Peruvian highlands. But she's from America, pretty close to the sea level. So every year that she travels there, excuse me, she experiences altitude sickness, where she's at a higher altitude. and she's not getting as much oxygen in her lungs. So she experiences bouts of dizziness, nausea, fatigue, because her body just isn't getting enough oxygen. Now, there are some cultural adaptations to that, like you can take medications. Resting is a big thing. If you're a mountain climber or watch mountain climbers, you know that they don't scale the entire mountain in one go. They go to different base camps, and that's to give their body time to acclimate to the less oxygen in the air. Now, what's interesting is when we look at indigenous communities who have lived in high altitude for many, many, and I mean many generations, they have developed a biological adaptation. The adorable children with the baby llamas are Peruvian kids, indigenous Peruvian kids. And because their families have lived there for like 100,000 years, um, they have slightly larger rib cages than those of us who are not from the highlands. Now, is it so drastically bigger that if I put an indigenous Peruvian skeleton next to a white American skeleton, am I going to be able to glance at it and be like, oh, that's the Peruvian, their rib cage is massive? No, but it is slightly larger. And basically, what we think is it's evolution happening to help them adapt to getting more oxygen in their lungs. Because with the rib cage a little bigger, the lungs can expand a little bit more and take in more oxygen with each breath. Now, evolution works slowly. So, does that mean there are different species than us? No. Does that mean if Valda here moves to Peru and has babies, are her babies going to have bigger rib cages? Only if she has babies with an indigenous Peruvian, maybe. But otherwise, no, it doesn't happen that quickly. This is happening over thousands of hundreds of thousands of years. But it is interesting. If it was something where we walled off Peru and didn't let anybody in or out for another 100,000 years, could they maybe evolve separately from us? Yeah, but thankfully we're not doing that. Um, so don't do that. But yeah, maybe. But right now, no, they have enough interaction with the rest of us that it's not like they're not evolving separately. I don't want you to think that. A term I will use a lot is ethnocentrism. It is the belief that the ways of one's own culture are the only correct or proper ones. So, a lot of us, I've fallen into the ethnocentric trap before, especially before I was studying anthropology, where I genuinely thought that the way we did things was the only correct way. Because, to be fair, I was brought up in the society where I was told this is the correct way to do things, and if you do it differently, you're wrong. But then I had to learn that just because we do it this way doesn't mean another culture who does it differently is going against God or going against nature or anything like that. We all kind of have culture-bound ideas, a perspective that produces theories about the world reality that are based on the assumptions and values from the researcher's own culture. So looking at like the comic I have, it's a pretty cheesy comic on here, but you have a woman in a bikini and sunglasses on the left, and then a woman, I believe, I'm not an expert, so I might be wrong, but I believe she is wearing a burqa and a niqab, because you can see her eyes. So everything is covered but her eyes. And there are a few countries in the Middle Eastern area where women legally have to dress like that. Now, where it's making you kind of look at it a little different is they're both assuming things about the other person, where the woman completely covered is thinking the woman has her whole body exposed and only her eyes covered, and that must be because that's what men want. And the woman in the bikini is looking at the woman covered and thinking the exact opposite. Oh my gosh, everything is covered but her eyes. It must be what men want. And this isn't a dig on men, but rather to say each of these women is assuming the other one personally doesn't want to dress like that and has to. Whereas in reality, a lot of these women want to dress like that. Similarly, in America, we don't make you wear a bikini. There are just a lot of women that like to. Now, do they maybe get male attention? And some of them, that's the goal. Yeah, some of them. But a lot of them, no. Bikini doesn't mean I want men's attention. It just means it's hot out. Um, so it's kind of meant to give you that example of don't assume things about another culture just because they're doing something differently. Look further in. Now, if you go further in and you find out that the woman in the bikini hates wearing a bikini, but she's been taught since she was a little kid that that's what men want, then yeah, that's going to be a problem. That's where I'd say, okay, yeah, you should dress how you want to dress. But we need to make sure that we're kind of taking an outsider's look as well. So if ethnocentrism is on one end of the spectrum, cultural relativism would be on the other. It's the attitude that a society's customs and ideas should be described objectively and understood in the context of that society's own culture and belief system.
Broke out a little bit.
Sorry about that. I'm good. So hopefully it's working. The belief that efforts at understanding other life ways are most successful if we view those customs in their own traditional context and avoid judging them according to the values of Western culture. So basically saying when we see a culture that's doing something that is against our norms, our gut reaction might be, oh my gosh, I was always taught that that's wrong, so therefore they're wrong. And really, what we need to do is kind of take a look at, well, why do they do that? Why do we say it's wrong? And why are they okay with it? And maybe we look a little further and we find out, like, no, I really do think it's wrong. Or we say, oh, I guess it's not wrong. It's just not what I'm used to. Now, there are limits. If we think of every society as unique and that because they think it's right, then we might, hold on, that was a terrible sentence. We might dismiss things that are actually wrong. So the example I have, it's no pun intended, it's a cheesy example. But you have to ask yourself what the culture is doing. Is it stinky cheese or is it as extreme as genocide? So, for example, there are quite a few cultures out there that eat food that is very pungent, which is a nice way of saying stinky. And there are a lot of stinky cheeses out there. So let's say you travel and you get to a country and they say, our national dish is called stinky cheese quiche. And it stinks to high heaven, but we love it. And you smell it and you think, ooh, not for me. I don't even want to try it. But you wouldn't say, oh my gosh, they're terrible people for eating the stinky cheese because they're not forcing people to eat it. If you don't want to, you don't have to. They're not forcing you to experience it, and they're not hurting anybody. Now, would I want the stinky cheese? No, I'm not a fan, but um, I may not want it. But as long as they're not forcing it on me, okay. But let's say you go traveling and what you encounter is that this culture is fully enacting a genocide on another culture. They are trying to systematically wipe out and kill this other culture. I'm not saying that you have the power to stop them individually, but you can confidently say, no, this is wrong. Even though that culture is adamant that what they're doing is right, you can look at it and say, they are hurting people, they are killing people. And therefore, I can confidently say, no, this is not okay. I'm not being ethnocentric when I say don't kill people. I'm just being human and trying to keep people alive. So, yeah, it's a little ridiculous of a spectrum to say stinky cheese or genocide. But the main thing is to ask, is this hurting anyone? Is this harming someone physically or psychologically? So, again, if they're tying people down and force feeding them stinky cheese, yeah, I'm going to say that's not okay. But if it's just that the majority of the people like this fragrant cheese, fine. As long as you're not hurting anybody. Now, every once in a while in anthropology, we end up with two words that are very, very similar. Here's an example. Emic with an M and etic with a T. And I'll explain why there's an alien on the slide because it might help you remember the difference. It might not. Emic with an M is the insider perspective. It's what we try to embody when we look at a cultural phenomenon from the perspective of someone from that culture, native to that culture. So, like stinky cheese. The emic perspective would be we are known for making this stinky cheese. Everybody in the world knows we make the best stinky cheese, and we're very proud of it, and we like to incorporate it in a lot of our national dishes. Edic is the outsider with a T. That is when you look at a cultural phenomenon from the perspective of someone who is not from that culture. So, an outsider perspective of stinky cheese might be yuck. That smells disgusting. I don't care if you've been making it for hundreds of years. Stop making it. It smells awful. Now, I'm realizing how up in arms I sound about stinky cheese. I'm really not that upset. Um, a good example from like a friend of a friend. So there's an anthropologist who traveled to a rural part of, I think it was in Guatemala, and he was going to set up camp just outside of the village. And when he's setting up his camp, one of the villagers comes up and says, "Hey, no problem, you can camp here. But just as a heads up, don't put your toilet near that river." And he asks why. And the villager says, look, we put toilets there once, and it really angered the water spirit. And the water spirit, in turn, made the whole village sick. The emic perspective is there's a religious reason why you don't put your toilet next to that river. It upsets the river spirits, and we don't want to do that. The Edic perspective would be, yeah, that's your drinking water supply. If you put a toilet that empties into a drinking water supply, that's how cholera happens, and you're going to make the entire village sick. But even though the anthropologist may know the scientific explanation as to why, it's not going to do any good to argue with them or tell them they're wrong. And who knows? It's really hard to prove or disprove water spirits. Maybe it's both. Maybe the water spirit knows you're contaminating your drinking water and was mad. It does no good to really argue, but it does help us understand, like, am I taking an insider look or an outsider look? The reason why I have the alien, if this helps you, use it as a tool. Because the words are so similar, another word for an alien is extraterrestrial, abbreviated as ET, like the movie from 1980, if you're old like me. So, Edic is the outsider. It starts with ET, and the outsider is like the alien. So, if that helps you remember the difference, awesome, use that trick. If not, just ignore me and ignore the little alien. But if it helps, use it. Now, here is an example. Sorry to just throw a mummy at you. Um, this ceremony is Famadihana, and it is celebrated in Madagascar. I think it's every 7 years. When people pass away in this indigenous community, they are wrapped in shrouds and put in caves. There, they naturally mummify. Every 7 years or so, they have a celebration where they go to the caves, remove the most recently deceased people from a few years ago, carry them back home, clean them. They're not like giving them a bubble bath, but kind of brushing them off, maybe changing their clothes, rewrapping them in a shroud, and then bringing them back to the cave. The Edic perspective as an American, we're used to when someone passes away, they're gone. We don't touch them anymore. And so this, to a lot of you, may be a little jarring, a little, oh God, they're touching dead bodies. And it may seem disrespectful to us because we think it's respectful once you put a body to rest to never touch them again. But the emic perspective from these people is This is a way to show we care and respect about them, or we care and respect them. We miss them. We're saying, hey, we didn't forget about you. In fact, we're going to make sure that you're resting appropriately and that you've got a new blanket and that you're comfortable. And this is just our way of showing respect and to kind of say, we miss you, we're thinking about you, and we're going to still take care of you even in death. Now, I was hoping we might end early, but I think I'm going to run out of time. So we still have 10 minutes. Don't go anywhere yet. But I want to get into the body ritual of the Nakarema. So hopefully you read this on your own and didn't Google it because there is a little bit of a twist. So, body ritual of the Nakarema. This was published in 1956 in American Anthropologist, which is a pretty big publication. So it's a pretty big one. But 1956 was a hot minute ago. So, like I said when I was talking about reading articles, ideally we'd want to find one a little newer, and there really isn't too much written about the Nakarema, which could be your first clue. One of the things they talk about is that a large portion of their day is devoted to ritual activities, especially in a stone-walled shrine room. In fact, it's said that the wealthy have multiple shrines in their homes, and people will brag about it. Like, oh, I just got a new home. It has 3 shrine rooms. It's a bragging right. Frequently tied to these ceremonies and ritual activities, they see holy mouth men who drill holes in their teeth and perform other rituals. They are so obsessed with their mouths and teeth. It's said that if you have bad teeth, your lovers will leave you, your friends will abandon you, things like that. And so daily they do this mouth rite in these shrine rooms to try and take care of their teeth. And when you're reading this, you may realistically think, oh, what a bunch of weirdos. Oh, it seems kind of weird. Why are they drilling holes in their teeth? Why are they doing this? Why are they so obsessed with their teeth? And where I say there is a little twist, Nakorema is American backwards. So that's what twist. Okay, it's not like the most epic twist. This article is the only scam article I will ever make you read. It is the only time I will lie to you. I promise. It was written from an Edic view about our own culture. So it was made with the goal to make you read it thinking, what a bunch of weirdos. Why are they doing this? This is so odd. The daily mouth rite is brushing, flossing, and gargling. Most of us, I would say, do that at least once a day, um, and take care of us. We see holy mouth men, they're dentists. Um, they drill holes in our teeth. I've had quite a few cavities. They have drilled holes in my teeth. And we are kind of obsessed with our teeth. So much so that we advertise the perfect smile. You should get braces if your teeth are a little crooked. If they're crooked enough and off color, you should get veneers because the better your teeth, the better your life. I look at modern Hollywood now. I love a historical film. And one of the things that takes me out of the magic of Hollywood is when I'm watching something. I watched the series 1883, which of course takes place in 1883, and it's families on the Oregon Trail, hard living in the late 1800s. And yet, every single one of those people on that show had the brightest, whitest, straightest teeth. And it, for me, took me out of the show because I was thinking that is not historically accurate. People did not have those kinds of teeth in 1883. Maybe celebrities, but not the people there. It was, yeah, it was still an interesting show, but yeah, the teeth messed with me a little bit. So why did I make you read this? It wasn't just to trick you. I have better things to do than that. Um, it was written as a way to entrap the reader. It wants you, or Horace Minor, I should say, he wanted you to read this article feeling a bunch of ethnocentrism and feeling that gut reaction of like, God, that's weird. That's so weird. And then the big gag at the end is, we were talking about us the whole time. So he has us questioning things that we think are normal. Yes, it's an elaborate ruse, but it's supposed to be forcing us to kind of take that outsider perspective so that by the end of the article, we're now realizing, like, oh, those weirdos are us. One of the things I should have included a photo. One of the things that trips up modern readers, because this is from the 1950s, is there is a segment where Miner talks about Nakarima women putting their heads in small ovens. If you're a hairdresser, you know what it is. They're falling out of favor now, but it used to be more common that if you went to the salon, they have these hair dryers that are like domes that come down over your head. And you can still usually find one in most salons nowadays, but most people aren't using them. But they used to be way more common in the 1950s, so that is a little lost in time. But yeah. So again, I'm sorry, that was the only scam I will ever pull on you. But it's just to kind of get us thinking about some of the things we do and that we're a little weird sometimes. Oh, yay, I'm not going to run out of time. I'm right on schedule. So I will continue or kind of wrap up by saying, what's the value of anthropology? Yes, this counts for college credits, so it's got a value there for you, but it also hopefully will have value as you go through life. On the individual level, studying anthropology, it helps provide a better understanding of our own culture and helps us take that outsider perspective so that we can kind of, yeah, we can see other, quote, weird things cultures do, but we can also look at some of the weird things we do and kind of question why. From a societal point, studying anthropology helps us understanding different cultures that can contribute to the solution of pressing societal problems. When we're looking at a global issue that all of us are facing, like climate change, I would say we need a very holistic approach. We can't only listen to the billionaire capitalists because they may not have the rest of us in their forethought. They're thinking profit. We need to talk to the indigenous communities, to the smaller groups, to the people on the ground on how they are handling climate change and try to kind of take a small thing that works and maybe see if we can expand it. So next week, hopefully we won't get like a foot of snow. Um, we don't know though. Michigan is weird. So what we're gonna do, oh, I'm sorry, I was supposed to have something else available under week 3, but Kotak chapter 3 from your book. That's the only reading I have for next week. We're just gonna do that. It is kind of a heavier reading because it introduces you to a lot of people. I will try to introduce them a little bit more next week. Thank you for joining me online and staying home and safe. That is all I have for today. So you are free to go. Thank you. And I will see you next week. Have a good one.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
Have a good week.
You too.